5 countries blocked Netanyahu's plane. The global order is collapsing in real time. 5 countries blocked Netanyahu's plane, and suddenly the rules that governed world diplomacy for decades began to look fragile. Not one country, not a symbolic protest. 5 sovereign nations closing their skies at the same time. For generations, the international system relied on a quiet assumption. No matter how tense politics became, world leaders could still travel. They could fly across continents, sit at negotiation tables, and prevent conflicts from spiraling into something far worse. But something unusual just happened. Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and Sweden. 5 countries at the northern edge of Europe made a declaration that stunned diplomatic circles. They said that if Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu entered their territory, or even their airspace, he could be arrested, not turned away, not warned, arrested. And suddenly a quiet question began circulating among diplomats, investors, and strategic planners around the world. What happens to the global system when a sitting world leader can no longer move freely across it? Because this moment is not simply about one flight path. It is about a legal system that may be starting to challenge political power, an alliance that may be beginning to fracture, and a world order that might be slowly changing its rules in real time. Stay with the story until the end. Because what begins with an airspace restriction may reveal something much deeper about how power, law, and economics are colliding in today's geopolitical landscape, and why serious observers across governments, markets, and boardrooms are watching this moment very carefully. Welcome to Warfront Global. Before the analysis continues, the channel would like to ask viewers something in a respectful way, the way someone might gently remind a thoughtful elder before they leave the house. Have they subscribed yet? If they value calm, serious analysis of global power and economics, they might consider pressing the subscribe button. Channels that focus on understanding how the world actually works rely on viewers who think carefully and look beyond headlines. And while they are here, the channel would also like to know something. Where in the world are they watching from? Are they in London, Karachi, Dubai, New York, Toronto, or somewhere else entirely? The audience gathered here represents people across the globe who want to understand how geopolitics, economics, and strategy shape the future. Now, the analysis begins. Something unusual happened in the architecture of international diplomacy this week. At first glance, it looked like a legal announcement. But for those who study global power systems, it represented something deeper. A moment when one of the quiet rules of international politics was openly challenged. 5 Nordic nations, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and Sweden, announced that if Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu entered their territory, authorities would enforce an arrest warrant issued by the International Criminal Court. For casual observers, this may sound like another legal dispute. But for diplomats, investors, and geopolitical strategists, the implications were far more significant. Because the modern international system has always relied on one basic principle: leaders must be able to travel. Even during moments of extreme political tension, diplomacy required mobility. Presidents crossed oceans to negotiate nuclear arms agreements. Rival governments sent envoys across borders to prevent conflicts from escalating. Diplomatic movement was not simply a privilege, it was one of the mechanisms that kept the global system functioning. And that is why the Nordic announcement sent quiet shockwaves through strategic circles. The issue was not simply whether Netanyahu would fly through Nordic airspace. The deeper issue was that 5 Western countries had signaled they were willing to challenge a long-standing diplomatic norm. Historically, international legal warrants against world leaders have existed in a delicate space between law and politics. Governments often acknowledged such warrants, but enforcement was frequently avoided to preserve alliances and maintain diplomatic stability. The Nordic decision disrupted that pattern. For the first time in this case, a coordinated group of Western governments openly committed to enforcing the warrant if circumstances required it. In the world of geopolitics, moments like this often appear small when they occur. But later, they are sometimes remembered as the first signs that the architecture of global power is beginning to shift. If the Nordic airspace decision represented the first visible crack in the system, the response from Washington revealed something even more significant. Because at the exact same moment European governments were turning to legal frameworks, the United States was signaling something very different. The word came from the Pentagon. American forces had been, in their words, unleashed. In the language of diplomacy, words are chosen with extreme care. Every phrase in an official statement carries weight. And unleashed is not a word commonly used by diplomats or negotiators. It is a word that suggests restraint has been removed. To strategic observers, that single word revealed a widening gap between 2 approaches to global power. On one side stood Washington, signaling military readiness and strategic escalation. On the other stood parts of Europe, emphasizing international law, court rulings, and legal enforcement. 2 responses to the same geopolitical crisis, but based on completely different philosophies. This divergence did not appear overnight. For years, subtle tensions had been building inside the Western alliance. European governments increasingly found themselves navigating a delicate balance between alliance loyalty and domestic political pressure. Public opinion in several European countries had begun demanding stronger adherence to international legal standards. At the same time, the United States remained primarily focused on strategic stability and regional security. These two priorities do not always align. When security considerations dominate, legal frameworks are often interpreted flexibly. When legal institutions dominate, strategic alliances can face new constraints. The Nordic decision suggested that certain European states had reached a point where institutional law could no longer remain secondary. For the business community, this development may seem distant from day-to-day economic activity. But in reality, alliance stability sits at the foundation of the modern global economy. The Western Alliance has historically functioned as the central stabilizing structure for global trade routes, energy markets, financial institutions, and multinational investment. Corporations build supply chains assuming that Western political coordination will remain predictable. Banks allocate capital assuming that strategic partners will continue acting within shared frameworks. But when internal disagreements become visible, those assumptions begin to weaken. History provides several examples where fractures inside powerful alliances reshape the global economic landscape. The Suez Crisis of 1956 exposed divisions between the United States and its European allies. That disagreement altered the balance of power in the Middle East and accelerated the decline of traditional European colonial influence. The Iraq War in 2003 revealed another major fracture, with several European countries openly opposing American strategy. Each of these moments forced investors, governments, and multinational companies to reassess risk. The current situation carries a similar structural characteristic. When 5 European countries publicly enforce an international legal action against a close American ally, they send a signal that the internal consensus of the Western Bloc is no longer guaranteed. Markets interpret such signals carefully, not because they immediately trigger economic collapse, but because they introduce a new variable into global strategic planning. If Western governments begin acting under diverging legal and political frameworks, coordination on future crises could become slower and more complicated. Sanctions regimes may fracture. Military alliances may face internal debate. Diplomatic negotiations may encounter new obstacles. Each of these outcomes increases uncertainty. And uncertainty, more than any specific policy decision, is what markets struggle to price. For decades, the global economy has operated under a relatively stable geopolitical assumption. Western powers may disagree privately, but they ultimately present a unified strategic front. The Nordic airspace decision and the American military response suggest that this assumption may now be entering a new phase, a phase where disagreements are no longer quiet, but increasingly visible. And when such disagreements surface at the highest levels of international politics, the ripple effects rarely remain confined to diplomacy alone. While much of the global media focused on the dramatic political tension surrounding the airspace decision, another development inside Europe received far less attention. Yet it may carry even deeper long-term implications. In Sweden, policymakers quietly introduced a national initiative worth roughly $150 million. The purpose of this program was not military expansion, nor was it a diplomatic response. Instead, the funding was directed toward something far more revealing: civilian preparedness. Local communities across the country were instructed to strengthen emergency supply systems. Storage facilities for food, medicine, and energy reserves were expanded. Municipal authorities began reviewing contingency plans for maintaining critical services during prolonged disruptions. To casual observers, such measures may appear routine. Governments often prepare for natural disasters or logistical emergencies, but strategic planners interpret these actions differently. Civilian preparedness programs of this scale typically emerge when governments believe that the possibility of large-scale systemic disruption has moved from theoretical risk to realistic probability. In military doctrine, this concept is often described as total defense. The idea behind total defense is simple but powerful. A nation does not rely solely on its armed forces during periods of instability. Instead, the entire society, public institutions, infrastructure systems, and civilian populations becomes part of the resilience framework. Scandinavian countries historically maintained elements of this doctrine during the Cold War, when the possibility of confrontation between major powers was a constant concern. However, many of these systems were gradually reduced in the decades following the collapse of the Soviet Union, as Europe entered what many believed would be a long period of geopolitical stability. The recent Swedish initiative suggests that some governments are beginning to reconsider those assumptions. For business leaders and investors, this type of government behavior serves as an early indicator. Governments possess access to intelligence assessments, security briefings, and strategic risk evaluations that are not publicly available. When those governments begin expanding civilian preparedness programs, they are often responding to long-term risk scenarios that extend beyond immediate headlines. From an economic perspective, preparedness policies influence several critical systems simultaneously. Supply chains must adapt to new logistical priorities. Insurance companies reassess risk exposure. Energy reserves require long-term planning and infrastructure investment. Even financial markets begin to respond when national security policies shift toward resilience and emergency readiness. This does not necessarily mean that conflict is imminent, but it does indicate that policymakers are preparing for an environment where disruptions, whether geopolitical, economic, or technological, could occur more frequently. The Nordic airspace decision, the widening strategic differences within the Western alliance, and the expansion of civilian preparedness programs are not isolated events. Together, they form a pattern suggesting that parts of Europe are quietly adjusting their strategic posture for a world that may become less predictable than the one they experienced during the previous generation. For entrepreneurs, investors, and business strategists, moments like these require careful observation. Because long before global systems visibly change, governments often begin preparing for those changes in silence. While diplomatic tensions and alliance fractures dominate political headlines, seasoned economic observers often focus on a different layer of global stability: energy. Because throughout modern history, geopolitical crises only become truly dangerous for the global economy when they intersect with energy supply. And at the center of the current strategic landscape lies a narrow waterway that most people rarely think about: the Strait of Hormuz. At its narrowest point, this passage is only about 21 miles wide. Yet through that small corridor flows roughly 1/5 of the world's daily oil supply. Tankers carrying energy resources from the Persian Gulf must pass through this route before reaching international markets. From there, the oil travels to Europe, Asia, and North America, powering factories, transportation systems, and entire national economies. In other words, the Strait of Hormuz is not merely a shipping route. It is one of the most critical pressure points in the architecture of the global economy. When analysts discuss geopolitical instability in the Middle East, this narrow corridor almost always becomes part of the conversation. Because history shows that disruptions to energy supply do not remain confined to the energy sector. They ripple outward into inflation, transportation costs, manufacturing expenses, and financial markets. The most famous example of this dynamic occurred in 1973 during the Arab oil embargo. In response to geopolitical tensions during the Yom Kippur War, major oil-producing nations restricted exports to the United States and several Western allies. Within a short period of time, oil prices multiplied dramatically. Fuel shortages appeared across developed economies, industrial production slowed, inflation surged to levels that governments struggled to control. The economic shock reshaped global policy for decades. Western countries began building strategic petroleum reserves. Energy diversification became a national priority. Governments realized that access to energy resources was not merely an economic issue, it was a matter of national security. Today, when analysts mention the Strait of Hormuz in the context of geopolitical conflict, they are drawing on those historical lessons. The concern is not necessarily that energy supplies will immediately collapse. The concern is that markets may begin pricing in the possibility of disruption. Energy markets operate largely on expectations. If traders believe that a conflict could threaten shipping routes, insurance costs for tankers begin rising. Freight companies adjust risk premiums. Energy importers start seeking alternative supply contracts. These adjustments cascade across the entire economic system. For businesses, rising energy costs translate into higher transportation expenses and manufacturing overhead. For governments, inflationary pressure forces central banks to reconsider interest rate strategies. Even financial markets respond rapidly to such signals. When investors sense geopolitical instability around critical energy corridors, capital often shifts toward commodities, energy producers, and assets perceived as resilient during inflationary periods. This is why geopolitical analysts pay close attention to developments in the Middle East whenever diplomatic tensions escalate. Energy infrastructure sits at the intersection of politics, economics, and global security. The airspace decision made by the Nordic countries, the widening philosophical divide within the Western alliance, and the strategic signals emerging from Europe all form part of a larger geopolitical landscape. But when those developments occur alongside uncertainty surrounding global energy supply routes, the stakes become significantly higher. Because once energy markets begin reacting, the economic consequences extend far beyond the region where the crisis began. For investors, entrepreneurs, and strategic planners, the lesson remains consistent. Political events may start the story, but energy supply determines how large that story ultimately becomes.